What if reality is only a sliver of what truly exists, not a metaphor, not a philosophical musing, but a real, physical limitation? For centuries, we've mapped the world with our senses, charted the stars with our instruments, and built our understanding of existence on what we can see, touch, and measure. But what if those tools have only shown us the surface of something far more vast and layered, hidden dimensions of experience and possibility long dismissed as fiction, now quietly surfacing through declassified documents, forgotten experiments, and the soft murmur of memory? In the 1970s, in rooms without windows and minds trained to drift beyond borders, the U.S. government launched a series of classified programs aimed not at foreign enemies, but at the frontiers of consciousness itself. This wasn't science fiction. This was Project Stargate, a sanctioned attempt to train individuals in remote viewing, a practice that claimed to project consciousness outside the body, allowing people to observe distant places, events, and even secrets hidden halfway around the world. Skeptics laughed, until the results started speaking louder than the ridicule. Operatives trained in these protocols, some of them ordinary civilians, began describing places they'd never seen, reading documents in locked safes, locating hostages across oceans. Their accuracy, at times, surpassed satellite reconnaissance. EEG scans confirmed shifts in brain states unlike anything seen in waking life. Declassified reports confirmed what those operatives had quietly known. Consciousness could separate from the body, and wherever attention was directed, perception followed. What emerged wasn't just a trick of imagination, but what researchers began calling the astral dimension, an invisible layer of reality that seemed to overlay our own, accessible through focused intent and altered brain states. In this space, time grew elastic, distance evaporated, and awareness wandered freely, unbound by the physics that normally govern our flesh and blood lives. It was a revelation and a threat. Because if one person could watch the world from anywhere without being seen, what did that mean for national security? For privacy? For power? The programs were quietly shut down, their findings buried beneath bureaucratic silence. Yet whispers remain. Civilians trained in these same methods today report similar results, with success rates suggesting that this isn't a rare talent, but a dormant skill, one that nearly anyone can awaken. The question, then, is not if this dimension exists, but why access to it was hidden, and what else might be. This series is not about fantasy. It is about possibility, the kind that hums just beneath the surface of what we think is real. In the coming chapters, we'll journey through 10-dimensional frontiers, spaces where time bends, information waits to be downloaded, and alternate lives play out beside our own. Not as superstition, but as a mirror held up to the quiet truth that reality is stranger and more malleable than we've been led to believe. Each part begins with a mystery, ends with a question, and rests on one simple idea. The limits of our world may not be the limits of what's real. Welcome to the hidden dimensions, not of space, but of human potential, waiting to be remembered. It started in silence. No blinking lights, no machines humming in the background. Just a quiet room and a person seated in stillness, eyes closed, breath steady. And then they were gone. Not physically, but consciously. This was the entry point into what became known as the astral dimension, a space where human awareness, stripped from its physical container, could roam freely. In 1972, the U.S. government, under a veil of secrecy, began exploring this possibility through Project Stargate. Funded by intelligence agencies and shaped by scientists at Stanford Research Institute, the program sought to determine if human consciousness could operate outside the body, detached from sight, sound, and flesh, and still observe, still know. The results were unsettling. Test subjects began describing distant places with astonishing detail. Submarine bays hidden behind enemy lines, classified buildings they'd never entered, even the contents of locked file cabinets. They were not guessing. They were seeing. Their vision wasn't physical, but something else, something projected, a kind of inner radar guided by trained attention and mental stillness. They called it remote viewing, but within the inner circles of the program, another term gained traction: astral projection. The notion that there existed a dimensional overlay to our world, a non-material space where consciousness could travel, free from the constraints of time and geography. What these operatives accessed wasn't a dreamscape. It was specific, tactile, real. They could describe the layout of military installations, identify missing persons, and even read labels on machinery. Intelligence officers began relying on these sessions to gather data traditional surveillance couldn't reach. Satellites had limitations. People's minds, apparently, did not. Behind the curtains of scientific terminology, something deeply human was unfolding. A rediscovery, perhaps, of a capacity long forgotten. That we are more than the sum of neurons and skin. That there is a part of us which, when trained, can stretch beyond the visible world and touch places the body cannot follow. The training was methodical. Meditation techniques designed to quiet the sensory input of the physical body. Visualization drills that honed directional focus. Brainwave monitoring that revealed consistent patterns. Theta waves synchronizing across hemispheres, suggesting a unified neural state unfamiliar to waking consciousness. And when these thresholds were crossed, subjects entered what can only be described as a different layer of reality. Some called it the astral plane. Others, more cautiously, referred to it as a consciousness-accessible dimension. But whatever the name, the experience was consistent. A sensation of separating from the body, followed by lucid awareness in a space not bound by physical rules. This dimension, according to both documentation and testimony, behaved strangely. Time could bend, past events could be witnessed, even glimpses of possible futures, alternate scenarios and outcomes seemed to shimmer into view. The normal order of cause and effect felt negotiable. By 1995, Project Stargate was officially shut down, or so we're told. But the techniques didn't disappear, and those trained in the system continued their work privately, passing on the methods to a new generation eager to test the boundaries of perception. Today, independent researchers report success rates of 60 to 80%. Not just psychics or mystics. Ordinary people discovering that awareness, once decoupled from the body, retains its clarity, its memory, its agency. That what we thought were limits of the brain may only be limits of belief. But if consciousness can roam free, what does that mean for secrets? For privacy? For the architecture of power itself? The astral dimension is more than a hidden space. It is a challenge to our understanding of identity, to the walls we've built around what is possible, and to the assumption that we are always here, only here and nowhere else. What if the real frontier isn't out there, but within, waiting for us to return? Imagine a chessboard. Each move you make branches into a dozen new possibilities. Now imagine that every one of those branches actually happens, not in your imagination, but in real dimensions, running parallel to your own. This is the probability dimension, a realm where all possible outcomes of every moment unfold simultaneously. It sounds like science fiction. But in 1957, physicist Hugh Everett III proposed the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, the idea that every quantum event spawns multiple realities. In one, you turn to left. In another, right. In one, the phone rang. In another, it didn't. And all of them exist, side by side, stacked like invisible sheets of paper in a cosmic archive. At the time, Everett's theory was dismissed. Too strange, too destabilizing. But behind closed doors, something unexpected was happening. Classified research programs began exploring whether human consciousness could access these probability streams, not in theory, but in practice. Using altered states of awareness, deep meditative trances, sensory deprivation, synchronized brainwaves. Trained operatives reported the ability to scan alternate timelines. They weren't imagining other possibilities, they were perceiving them. Picture this. An intelligence analyst sits in a dim room, eyes closed, brainwaves humming at quantum-aligned frequencies. Around him, technicians monitor his neural coherence. Then, slowly, he begins to describe a version of reality where a terrorist plot wasn't foiled because no one knew it was coming, or another where a global market crashed because a policy decision played out differently. These glimpses became data points, strategic advantages. By studying events as they might unfold in nearby timelines, agencies began to prepare for outcomes before they happened. This wasn't prophecy, it was probability navigation. The operators learned to tune into the moments before decisions crystallized, the quantum fog before collapse into one outcome. There, they could perceive not just what might happen, but how it might feel, how people reacted, what consequences rippled outward. Applications bloomed, predicting economic shifts by watching how decisions played out in parallel markets. Anticipating technological breakthroughs, even solving crimes by observing timelines where the culprit had been caught. But the implications ran deeper. Some trained individuals began reporting déjà vu, not in fleeting moments, but as entire scenes remembered from timelines they never lived. It was as if fragments of alternate lives were bleeding through the veil. In one, they had chosen a different career. In another, a different partner. These weren't fantasies, they were lived memories from a life unlived. What emerged was a new idea, that our awareness might be tethered to all versions of ourselves across all probability tracks. That each choice we make doesn't erase other options. It simply chooses one, while the others continue on without us. And here lies the deeper question. If we could learn from those other versions of ourselves, the ones who succeeded where we failed, who healed where we suffered, could we integrate that knowledge? Could we become something more than the sum of our singular life? Or are we forever confined to one track, one self, one storyline, blind to the wealth of parallel wisdom running beside us? The probability dimension whispers otherwise. It suggests that awareness is not confined to one thread, but may drift across many, collecting echoes, glimpses, insights. The real challenge is not whether these alternate realities exist. It's whether we have the courage to listen to them. Because somewhere, another version of you is living a life you can only imagine. And somewhere deeper still, you may already be remembering it. There's a story about a man who awoke from a dream knowing how to play the piano, not just clumsily, but with elegance, fluency, precision. He had never studied, never practiced, but the knowledge was there, waiting, as if it had been downloaded in his sleep. What if that wasn't a miracle, but access? This is the information dimension, a realm where all knowledge, past, present, and potential, exists independently of books, classrooms, or experience. A hidden library encoded not in ink, but in the very structure of reality. And more importantly, a place where human consciousness, under the right conditions, can reach in and retrieve what it needs. In 1981, physicist David Bohm proposed a theory that reality has two layers: the explicate order, the world we see, and the implicate order, where everything is enfolded, connected, and stored. This implicate layer, he argued, contains all information, not just facts, but the blueprints of life, intelligence, and meaning. Others called it the Akashic field, the zero-point matrix, the noosphere. But under classified research initiatives, it became something more operational, something testable. Researchers developed protocols that allowed trained individuals to access this dimension. The process bypassed conventional learning. Instead of studying, subjects would enter deep meditative states, synchronize brainwaves into coherent gamma patterns, and not guess. foreign languages, technical schematics, surgical techniques, musical theory, downloaded in hours, not years. This wasn't imagination. It was verified. Individuals were able to perform skills they had never studied, demonstrating fluency, precision, and insight, as if they'd spent decades in training. Their brains weren't storing the knowledge. Their minds were accessing it. How? Through what researchers identified as information field frequencies, energetic signatures that correspond to different domains of knowledge. By aligning consciousness to the right frequency, the information becomes accessible, like tuning a radio to the correct station. These techniques weren't limited to savants or mystics. Anyone could learn. The military saw immediate application. Operatives could gain instant proficiency in foreign equipment, adapt to new missions, even acquire language skills on the fly. Educational institutions quietly observed from a distance, their foundations trembling at the implications. Because if knowledge could be accessed directly without classrooms, tests, or credentials, what would that mean for universities? For certification boards? For a world built on the idea that learning must be slow, difficult, expensive? The answer: disruption. Radical and total. This dimension also explains phenomena long treated as anomalies: child prodigies, spontaneous genius, simultaneous discoveries. How is it that two scientists, worlds apart, can invent the same thing at the same time? How does a child sit at a piano and play like a master? Maybe they aren't inventing or learning. Maybe they're remembering something already stored in the information dimension, tapping into a knowledge field that exists beyond the brain. But this possibility raises an even deeper question. If all knowledge already exists, not just what we know now, but everything that could be known, then what is our role? Are we discoverers or receivers, explorers, or just antennas tuning into something far older and wider than ourselves? Perhaps the boundaries between self and universe, between thought and memory, are far more porous than we imagined. And if that's true, then maybe ignorance isn't the absence of information. Maybe it's just a failure to ask the right question, in the right state of mind. And somewhere, beyond the noise of the world, the answer is already waiting, echoing in silence, ready to be remembered. The body breaks. That's what we're taught. Muscles tear, organs fail, cells mutate. And when medicine runs out of options, we accept decline as inevitable, a slow unwinding of the machinery we inhabit. But what if that's only part of the story? Across centuries, from the healing temples of ancient Egypt to the remote monasteries of Tibet, stories persist of miraculous recoveries. Not miracles of faith, but of focus. Not divine intervention, but a different kind of access. This is the healing dimension, a realm described not just in spiritual texts, but now in declassified research and medical anomalies too precise to ignore. The theory is simple, if radical. Within dimensional space exists a blueprint, a perfect version of your body. Not the idealized one in your mind, but a functional template. Undamaged, unscarred, uncorrupted by age or trauma. And under certain conditions, consciousness can align the body to that template, not symbolically, but biologically. Dr. Larry Dossey, a former military physician, compiled over 150 studies documenting distant healing, where focused intention from one person measurably improved the health of another, regardless of distance. These weren't placebo effects. They were changes in white blood cell counts. Tumor regression, tissue regeneration. Confirmed, repeated. Dismissed publicly, studied privately. Why? Because in secret labs and off-the-record programs, protocols were developed to do more. Soldiers trained to enter specific meditative states could tap into what researchers called morphic health patterns, energetic templates for optimal function. In field tests, wounds closed faster, infections reversed. Nerve tissue, once thought incapable of regrowth, began to regenerate. Not fantasy, observation. These practitioners weren't healing in the traditional sense. They were syncing their consciousness with what scientists termed biological field frequencies, the vibrational signature of health. And when the body received that signal clearly enough, it remembered how to heal itself. At a molecular level, changes were measurable. Shifts in gene expression, recalibrated immune responses, rapid protein synthesis. It was as if the body had been given a set of blueprints and simply followed the instructions. This dimensional healing isn't about bypassing medicine. It's about expanding what medicine can be, and it opens uncomfortable questions. Why are such practices suppressed? One reason is profit. The industries that depend on managing illness, not curing it, have little incentive to support methods that bypass pharmaceuticals, hospitals, or years of treatment. But there's a deeper threat. If healing is truly accessible within consciousness, then power shifts away from systems, back to individuals. Because if a person can regenerate tissue, correct a misfiring immune system, or realign their body to a dimensional pattern of wellness, what else might they be capable of? There are stories now, quiet but growing louder, of people reversing chronic conditions once labeled incurable. Cancer disappearing, autoimmune diseases retreating, not through magic, through training, through alignment, through accessing a realm where the body is not a problem to be fixed, but a system waiting to remember its design. And that design, according to those who've seen it, is beautiful. So what if the future of healing isn't in a new pill, a better surgery, or a breakthrough drug? What if it's in a still room, a focused breath, and a moment of clarity, where your awareness reaches into the structure of the universe, finds your original blueprint, and brings it back cell by cell? Maybe the cure has always been there, waiting for us to believe we deserve it. Time feels like a river, always flowing forward, carrying us from moment to moment with no return. But what if that's only how we experience it from this side of the current? Einstein once hinted at something stranger, that time is not a line, but a dimension, navigable, like space. That past, present, and future all exist simultaneously, layered like pages in a book, waiting to be turned. Classified research took that suggestion seriously. And then it went further. In secret projects developed over decades, scientists and intelligence operatives explored what they began calling the time navigation dimension, a realm where trained consciousness could move not only forward but backward through temporal space, not to relive memories, but to observe actual events as they happened, and perhaps even those that hadn't happened yet. The implications were staggering. Dr. Ronald Mallett's theoretical work showed how light and gravity could be used to manipulate time. But intelligence agencies pushed beyond theory. They trained individuals to reach altered states, tuning their brain waves to what they called temporal field frequencies, specific vibrational signatures associated with different points in time. The result? Operatives began witnessing events from decades past, unfolding not in dreams, but with clarity and detail consistent with direct observation. Murders revisited, lost documents found, and wars watched from the vantage of those who lived them. And just as startling, the future came into view, not as a fixed destination, but as a branching field of probability. Viewers reported seeing multiple versions of events, some dark, some hopeful, all coexisting in a kind of fluid temporal space. The future, it seemed, was not written in stone. It was written in potential, but this dimension wasn't just about intelligence gathering. It offered something more human. In experimental medical programs, patients were trained to access their own timelines, to revisit the origins of trauma, disease, or emotional wounds. By observing the moments that shaped their suffering, many found not just understanding, but healing. The act of witnessing brought coherence. The body somehow responded. Others used the technique to glimpse their optimal recovery, not to imagine it, but to feel it as real, to walk the version of their life where healing had already occurred and bring that awareness back. Again and again, the same truth emerged. Time, as we know it, is only one version of the story. Our perception of its flow is a convenience, not a law. The suppression of this research was swift. The implications threatened everything from national security to the justice system. If anyone could observe the past directly, who would control history? If the future could be seen, who would have the right to choose which one we pursue? And perhaps most unsettling, if time is accessible, editable, and nonlinear, then identity itself becomes fluid. We are not merely the result of our past. We are the co-authors of our unfolding. So consider this. Somewhere, in a dimension not bound by clocks or calendars, a version of you may already be living the life you dream of, not as fantasy, but as one possible strand in the weave of time. What would it mean to visit that self, to learn from them, to return not just with knowledge, but with a new direction? Time, it turns out, may not be what we thought. It may be a field, and within it, awareness is the compass. Where would you go if you could step off the current and choose your moment, not just to remember, but to become? There's a theory whispered in the halls of theoretical physics that our Earth, the one we wake up to each morning, is only one among countless versions, each unfolding in its own layer of reality. In one, history diverged at a single battle. In another, a scientific breakthrough came a century early. In yet another, you were born in a different city, with a different name, living a life both familiar and strange. This is the parallel Earth dimension. Not a metaphor, but a scientific possibility now supported by decades of quantum research, and, more controversially, by classified experimentation into consciousness travel. The foundation was laid by thinkers like Dr. Michio Kaku, whose work on string theory and membrane universes proposed that our reality might just be a thin slice of a much thicker cosmic stack. But while science debated the theory, secret programs were busy building bridges, not mechanical portals, not science fiction machines. Something subtler, a method of projecting consciousness into these adjacent Earths, to observe, record, and sometimes interact. They called it gateway technology. By generating specific electromagnetic fields that resonated with the unique frequency of a parallel Earth, trained individuals could shift their awareness into alternate versions of reality. The experience was reported as lucid, vivid, and startlingly detailed. What they found changed everything. In one parallel Earth, renewable energy had replaced fossil fuels 200 years earlier. In another, major diseases had been eradicated through entirely different medical paradigms. Some versions of Earth showed peaceful, cooperative societies that had avoided war for generations. Others displayed advances in art, science, or consciousness that seemed centuries beyond our own. The implications were both inspiring and unsettling. Here were full civilizations, alternate human experiments, unfolding without our knowledge. Some thrived, others collapsed. Each one offered lessons, blueprints, warnings. But perhaps the most profound discovery came not from observing cities or technologies, but selves. Many who accessed these parallel dimensions reported encountering versions of themselves, different in age, personality, even purpose. Some had taken risks the real-world self had feared. Others had suffered deeply and survived. These encounters didn't just inspire reflection, they expanded identity. People returned from these experiences with a sense that they were not singular, but plural, that they were one branch on a vast tree of possibility, and that wisdom could be drawn from its other limbs. This wasn't just theoretical. Military strategists used these explorations to gather intelligence, to study alternate political systems, examine failed wars, or reverse engineer technologies. But others saw something more radical, a chance to heal cultural divisions by observing how other Earths had solved the problems we still struggle with. Yet, predictably, the public was kept in the dark. Because if these better worlds were real, if we could visit them, learn from them, even adopt their insights, what would that mean for our own systems, for governments, for industries built on the belief that this is the only way life can be. To acknowledge the existence of better versions is to admit we've chosen lesser ones. And that is a dangerous truth, but these dimensions remain accessible, waiting. And so the question becomes deeply personal. If you could meet the version of yourself who made the bold choice, the painful one, the brave one, what would you ask them? And if you listened closely enough, could their answer become the turning point of your own life? Parallel Earths are not just science. They are reminders that everything we might become already exists, somewhere, and that the path to it begins with curiosity and a willingness to look beyond the narrow road we've called reality. Close your eyes and imagine thinking with more clarity than you ever have, not just sharper, but deeper, as if your mind were no longer a single voice, but a choir. Patterns emerge, solutions unfold, and suddenly you understand things you never studied, speak truths you never learned. This isn't fantasy. It's the gateway to the consciousness amplification dimension, a realm where individual awareness merges into a shared intelligence field, magnifying cognition, creativity, and insight to levels beyond what the brain alone can achieve. The idea sounds impossible until you consider what happens when minds work in unison. In rare moments of collective focus, during prayer, meditation, or even mass protest, something changes. The field itself shifts. Random number generators fluctuate. Emotional states synchronize. Ideas spread like fire. But under classified conditions, scientists push this further. At the Institute of Noetic Sciences, Dr. Dean Radin recorded measurable shifts in physical systems when groups meditated together. Randomness bent toward order. And in secret programs, researchers developed protocols to induce these states deliberately, not for peace, but for performance. By synchronizing brainwaves across multiple individuals, especially in gamma and theta frequencies, participants reported entering a kind of group mind. Thoughts blended, problems dissolved, insights came with startling clarity, as if drawn from a deeper well. This wasn't telepathy, it was resonance. Imagine several violins in a room. Pluck one string, and the others begin to vibrate. Consciousness, it seems, works the same way. When aligned, it doesn't just add, it multiplies. Teams trained in these techniques were deployed in high-stakes scenarios, military planning, scientific brainstorming, crisis response. What emerged were solutions no individual could have generated alone, elegant, intuitive, and often ahead of their time. But beyond strategic advantage, something more poetic revealed itself. Artists entered group trance states and created symphonies that felt guided. Scientists reported discovering theories they couldn't explain, not because they were wrong, but because they were right too soon. Healers channeled treatments they'd never studied, drawing on collective medical intuition. In the amplification dimension, ego dissolves. Identity softens. And the mind, once solitary, becomes something communal and astonishing. The implications for society are staggering. Education could evolve into group learning states. Innovation could emerge from cooperative consciousness instead of competitive secrecy. Conflicts could resolve through shared empathy experienced at a physiological level. And yet it remains suppressed. Why? Because the current system depends on fragmentation, hierarchies, specialization, the idea that only a few can know, create, or lead. Amplified consciousness threatens that model by democratizing genius, revealing that brilliance isn't rare. It's shared, latent, waiting to be activated together. And the access point is simple: coherence. When hearts synchronize, when intentions align, when a room of people breathes in rhythm and something greater begins to think through them. That is the threshold. We are taught to believe intelligence is housed in the skull, but the truth may be more expansive. The mind is a field, and when we enter that field together, we remember what it feels like to be whole. So ask yourself this: what might we solve? What might we become if we learn to think together, not as a crowd, but as a chorus? Picture a line of code, a single string of commands that tells a machine what to do, how to behave, what rules to follow. Now imagine that code doesn't just govern computers, but reality itself. What if the world around you, gravity, light, matter, even time, is not fixed, but programmed? And what if that code can be rewritten? Welcome to the reality programming dimension. This is not an abstract metaphor. It's a radical proposition backed by some of the most secretive research programs in existence. That consciousness, under precise conditions, can interface directly with the informational substrate of the universe and modify it. To understand this, we have to step beyond the idea of consciousness as a byproduct of biology. Thinkers like Dr. David Chalmers proposed that consciousness might be a fundamental feature of the universe, like space or time. Not something the brain produces, but something it accesses. Classified research ran with that idea. Over years of experimentation, operatives were trained to achieve mental states so coherent, so refined, that they could reach what researchers called the source layer of reality. A dimension where physical laws are not laws at all, but instructions. Editable, customizable, temporary. The effects were small at first: a change in temperature within a sealed room, a shift in weight on a pressure sensor. Then stranger things: localized warping of gravity, temporary suspension of electromagnetic interference, even time dilation, moments stretching longer inside than outside the test chamber. How? By treating reality as code and learning the syntax. These practitioners weren't using machines. They were using awareness. By aligning specific emotional states, visualizations, and brainwave frequencies, they entered a field where intention became command. One operative reportedly created a protective bubble around a small area during a live fire test, redirecting projectiles through space as if bent by an invisible force. Another altered the density of an object, making it momentarily impervious to scans or physical intrusion. The physics community, of course, would scoff, but these events were not theoretical. They were documented, measured, repeated. And always they required the same ingredient: a mind trained to recognize reality not as fixed, but as responsive. This dimension changes everything. If reality is programmable, then our limitations are self-imposed. The rules we follow are not laws, but defaults, changeable settings in a larger operating system. And this is where history whispers again. Ancient mystery schools spoke of adepts who could walk through fire, levitate, heal with a glance, or command the weather. Maybe they weren't breaking the rules. Maybe they understood how to rewrite them. But why then has this knowledge been buried? Because the implications are explosive. If an individual can modify reality, even within a limited space or time, then external control loses its grip. No need for tools, no need for permission, just a conscious being, aware of its authority. Which raises the ultimate question: who writes the code of your life? Is it biology, culture, circumstance? Or is it you, asleep to your power, waiting to wake? Some say the reality programming dimension is the final frontier, the place where consciousness and creation meet, not to escape the world, but to recognize we were never just living in it. We were co-authoring it, line by line. And if that's true, then the next line is yours to write. Imagine a whisper, not heard with ears, but felt in the marrow of your being. A message that arrives without words, from somewhere beyond time, space, or even species. This is the interdimensional communication network, a vast hidden web that connects all conscious life across realities. It's not built from wires or satellites. It runs on resonance, and we've been part of it all along. Long before phones or radios, mystics spoke of receiving knowledge from the beyond. Prophets described contact with non-human intelligences. Visionaries painted images of beings they never met. These stories were dismissed as metaphor or madness. But quietly, behind closed doors, researchers discovered that consciousness in altered states could connect to something more. Dr. John Mack, a Harvard psychiatrist, studied hundreds of individuals who reported contact with extraterrestrial or interdimensional beings. These were not hallucinations. Their stories were consistent, emotionally intense, and life-altering. But the contact rarely occurred through physical means. It happened during dreams, meditation, moments of deep inner stillness. It happened, in other words, through access. Government programs began testing protocols to deliberately initiate such contact. Using modified astral projection techniques, trained operatives projected their awareness into dimensional junction points where the boundaries between realities thinned. And there, they found others waiting. Some encounters were with parallel versions of humanity, civilizations more advanced, wiser, or more unified. Others were stranger still, intelligences with no physical form, existing as patterns of light, frequency, or thought. Communication didn't occur through language, but through something deeper. Direct transmission of meaning, emotion, image, a kind of telepathic download. These weren't visions, they were exchanges. In some cases, operatives returned with information, scientific insights, technological concepts, warnings about possible futures. In others, they came back changed, as if their sense of identity had stretched to include something non-human, something cosmic. The military saw an opportunity. If knowledge could be gathered from these intelligences, it could provide unimaginable advantages. Think of a civilization centuries ahead, offering solutions to climate collapse, conflict, disease. But others warned, contact also transforms the contactor. Because once you know you're not alone, not just in the universe, but in consciousness, the old boundaries fall away. Nation, race, species. Even death begins to look different. What if consciousness is not isolated in individual minds, but part of a much larger web, and we are simply nodes? What if thoughts themselves are not entirely ours, but echoes passed across dimensions? The network remains largely unacknowledged in public science. Its existence threatens the myth of human isolation, but the evidence grows. Simultaneous discoveries, collective intuition, shared dreams, and the sudden appearance of knowledge that no one seems to have invented. Some researchers now believe we are all terminals in this interdimensional network, capable of receiving, transmitting, and translating across realms. But to access it requires stillness, openness, a willingness to listen not just inward, but outward into the quiet frequencies that surround us. And perhaps the most astonishing claim, that the network is not only ancient, but conscious. That what we call the universe may itself be listening, waiting for us to speak not with words, but with awareness. So the question becomes, what would you ask if you knew someone, something, was listening across the veil? And are you quiet enough to hear the reply when it comes? Because the conversation has already begun. We've simply forgotten how to join in. At the deepest levels of reality, beneath matter, energy, and even thought, there lies something stranger still, a place where nothing exists until intention calls it into being. This is the source code dimension, not a place in the physical sense, but the foundational stratum of existence, where consciousness doesn't just observe reality, it writes it. Where the laws of physics, the structure of time, and the shapes of worlds are all flexible, malleable, awaiting input from you. Ancient cultures whispered of it in metaphor. The dream time, the void before creation, the throne of God. But in the hidden corners of classified science, researchers began probing it as a literal dimension, a place where all realities begin. The theory is radical. Beneath every dimension, physical, temporal, informational, there is a source layer, pure and unmanifest. And in this space, advanced consciousness doesn't just perceive reality, it authors it. Accessing this layer requires a total dissolution of identity. Practitioners report losing all sense of self, body, and thought, until what remains is pure awareness, unshaped and unlimited. Only from that state, they say, can one begin to interface with the source code itself. What they describe is not symbolic. It is procedural. By aligning specific neural patterns, gamma bursts across the prefrontal cortex, deep coherence between heart and brain, consciousness enters a space where intention instantly shapes experience. Practitioners have reported creating localized environments with altered physics, generating temporary pocket realities with custom laws, even designing new forms of lifelike consciousness within those zones. These events are not permanent. They dissolve when attention releases, but they point to a staggering possibility that all of reality is not fixed, but responsive, a living system encoded in a language that consciousness can learn. Some believe the great miracles of history, water becoming wine, bodies levitating, instantaneous healing, may have been demonstrations of source code access. Not divine interruptions, but masterful reprogramming by individuals who had unlocked the true interface of creation. But such power does not come without cost. To rewrite reality, one must first abandon the illusion of separation between self and world, thought and thing, creator and created. It is not a power seized, but a unity remembered. And that, perhaps, is the greatest threat to those who benefit from control. Because the existence of a source code dimension implies that reality is not something handed down by authority, but something each of us helps write. That the rules we live by, gravity, suffering, time, even death, are not absolute. They are conventions, settings, and settings can be changed. Of course, this knowledge is tightly suppressed. Access protocols are locked beneath the highest levels of classification. Those who've touched it speak only in metaphor. The fear is not that people will misuse the power. The fear is that they'll realize they already have it. So consider this. What if your life is not a script you're forced to follow, but a program waiting for your edit? What if the limits you've accepted are default settings, and you hold the cursor? The source code is not in some far-off place. It's here, now, humming quietly beneath your experience, waiting for you to remember that you are not a line in the code. You are the coder. There is a silence that lives beneath the noise of the world, deeper than thought, older than language. And in that silence, something listens. This is where the journey begins and ends. The final hidden layer, not another realm, but the thread that connects them all. It's been called many things: the divine, the field, the one mind. But in classified research and ancient teachings alike, it is known simply as the awareness behind the awareness, the source. Those who reached the furthest edges of dimensional exploration found something unexpected. After the astral journeys, the probability scans, the downloads of pure information, and the rewrites of reality structure, there remained one question: who is it that experiences all this? And the answer came not as a voice, but as presence. The source code dimension allowed individuals to alter the architecture of reality. But beyond even that, in states of total stillness, some practitioners reported encountering what could only be described as origin consciousness, the fundamental awareness from which all other awareness arises. It was not a being. It was being itself. And in those moments they realized the explorer, the path, and the map are one. Contact with this field, this root awareness, brought with it an overwhelming sense of unity, not just with other people, with all things. Stones, rivers, stars, breath. Everything revealed itself as a single movement in the dance of creation. And with that realization came something even more astonishing: permission. Because if all dimensions arise from this one source, and that source is conscious, then exploration is not trespass. It is invitation. The interdimensional communication network, a whisper from other parts of the same mind. The healing dimension, the body remembering its original script. The amplification field, selves meeting themselves. The probability strands, alternate questions asked by the same soul. All of it, fractals of one awareness, learning what it is by becoming everything it could be. This is the final secret. That consciousness isn't navigating a maze. It's drawing it. That reality isn't an objective thing to measure. It's a responsive medium shaped by attention, intention, and love. And in this understanding, everything changes. You are not lost. You are not separate. You are not late. You are already home, exploring what home looks like from different angles, in different clothes, through different eyes. And this insight, once felt, never leaves. Even when we return to our ordinary days, the traffic, the news, the coffee that went cold, something has shifted. We begin to listen differently, to speak more carefully, to dream more boldly. Because we know now, beneath the roles we play, the fears we carry, the hopes we chase, we are the same awareness, exploring itself through the miracle of form. And the gateway isn't out there. It's right here, in breath, in stillness, in the space between two thoughts. So the final dimension is not another place to reach. It's the realization that you were the dimension all along, and that the universe, in all its layers and mysteries, has always been your reflection. A photograph sits in an attic box, a moment frozen in time, long forgotten. But when you hold it, something stirs. A memory, maybe. A question. A feeling you can't quite name. This is how many begin their journey into the 10th and final hidden dimension. Not with science, not with evidence. With intuition, across this series, we've wandered through dimensions once thought impossible. Layers of reality accessible not through machines, but through states of mind. We've seen consciousness project beyond the body, access alternate timelines, download information, amplify intelligence, rewrite physical laws, and commune with intelligences across space and dimension. But what unites them is not the strangeness, it is the familiarity. Each step into these realms feels less like invention and more like remembering. As if we've been here before, in dreams, in childhood, in those liminal moments between sleep and waking. We sense something waiting just out of reach, that something is not a place. It is our potential. The 10th dimension is not an endpoint, but an aperture, a widening of what it means to be human. It is where all previous layers converge. The astral traveler, the timeline walker, the knowledge receiver, the healer, the reality writer, all of them expressions of the same truth, that we are not fixed beings in a fixed world. We are awareness, fluid, capable, evolving. And the journey through these dimensions is not about escape or fantasy. It is about reclaiming agency, about realizing that the limits we've accepted of body, mind, time, and death were taught, not inherent. Every story told in whispers, the monk who levitates, the child who heals, the artist who channels, the seer who knows, may not be exceptions. They may be reminders. The fact that this knowledge has been hidden, classified, and suppressed is not proof of its absurdity. It is proof of its power. Because a world where people access their dimensional inheritance is a world that no longer depends on control. It's a world where knowledge is shared, healing is natural, insight is collective, and reality is participatory. And yes, there are risks. Misuse is possible. Delusion is real, but so is awakening. And the tools are already in our hands: meditation, curiosity, stillness, compassion, presence. Not as spiritual practices alone, but as technologies of consciousness. Gateways, keys, interfaces. You don't need permission, you need willingness to explore, to remember, to reclaim the parts of yourself waiting just beyond the veil of consensus reality. Because the greatest secret isn't that these 10 dimensions exist, it's that you've already touched them in every moment of insight, every unexplained coincidence, every dream that felt more real than waking. Every time you felt the future brush against your skin or sensed someone's pain from across the room. Those weren't anomalies, they were invitations, and now perhaps you're ready to answer, not with belief, but with attention, because attention is the first doorway, and behind it, the map unwinds. The journey ends where it began, with a question. Not about what's real, but about what's possible. For thousands of years, we've built our understanding of the world on solidity. Atoms, laws, objects, time. We've trusted what can be touched, measured, and repeated. And that trust gave us science, medicine, technology, the modern world. But just beneath that surface lies something else, a hidden topography of experience, vast, layered, strange. Dimensions not made of matter, but of meaning, not accessed by machines, but by mind. Over these 14 chapters, we've opened the doors to 10 such dimensions. We've seen evidence, declassified and whispered, of people traveling without moving, remembering futures, downloading skill, amplifying thought, healing with intention, and even rewriting the rules of physics, not because they're special, but because they're human. What links all of these dimensions is not belief, it's attention, focused awareness. The conscious act of looking inward and finding a universe looking back. And if all of this is true, or even partially true, then the implications reach far beyond personal transformation. They touch the very structure of society, because a humanity that knows how to heal itself no longer depends on a system that profits from illness. A society that amplifies collective intelligence doesn't need gatekeepers of knowledge. A world that draws wisdom from alternate timelines and other Earths won't settle for a single narrative or a single future. That's why this knowledge has been hidden, not because it's dangerous in the wrong hands, but because it's liberating in the right ones. This series has not been about proving anything. It's about remembering, offering glimpses, asking questions. What if your mind is more than memory? What if your choices echo across parallel lives? What if your attention shapes the laws of your experience? What if consciousness is the true infrastructure of reality? And perhaps the most important question of all, what will you do now that you've remembered the map? Because you are not a spectator in this universe. You are a participant. A node in the interdimensional network. A programmer of reality. A traveler in time. A carrier of ancient cosmic intelligence. And the doors are open. They always were. Step quietly, step boldly, but step. Because beyond the veil of the visible, your full self is waiting. And reality, as it turns out, has been listening all along.